Welcome to Wrist Swap. My name is Harrison. Today we're talking about the Explorer II, my journey with it. I've had it for about 2.5 months and I've put off making this video because I've had a little bit of back and forth on how I feel about it. Because it is so under the radar, it fits into my life, but at the same time, it's so under the radar that it doesn't scream, I need to stay in the collection. And I'm gonna talk through my thoughts on that near the end. Real quick, I wanna go through the history of the Explorer II just briefly. Essentially, it started in the 60s and 70s. The main call to fame was around spelunkers and the fact that people in caves for multiple days didn't know what time it was on the surface. Now you had the same problem on the poles, which were being explored increasingly more often, both in Antarctica and in the North Pole. People were doing these different trips, and so having that 24-hour scale was really helpful for people that either saw the sun the entire time that they were there for months, or had never seen the sun because it was dark for, again, several months. So that was the main attraction to a watch like this originally. And then it steered into looking mainly like a GMT Master 2 with a steel bezel. It's got the same dial, the same case, the same bracelet, the same hour hands, and I assume the same plots and everything else, with the exception being that obviously the black dial looks identical to a GMT Master 2 with a steel bezel, and then they offered a polar version or a white dial version. The one that I have is the 16570. This is from 2011. This is the last year that they made the 40mm version of the Explorer II. This one has the engraved rehaut, the 3186 with the parachrome hairspring, all that good stuff. So it's got the upgraded version of basically the last line of the 40mm models. And so I really like it for that reason. In terms of wearability, I'll throw the specs up on the screen. Most people know what these are around an Explorer II. It wears really, really nice. And that was one of the appealing parts about Rolex in general. I've looked at a lot of different watch brands: Omega, Zenith, Tudor, Hamilton, Rolex. And the thing that really I think is appealing about Rolex is their ergonomics. The way they design their cases is in such a way that it seems to be perfect. They're 36mm compared to a 36mm Omega, just have enough extra presence to where you feel like they're the perfect size, whereas a 36mm vintage Omega sometimes feels a little small. Their 40mm models are just big enough, especially in the 90s and early 2000s and before that. They seem to have the right size to just disappear on the wrist. And that's something I've really enjoyed about them. Even today, their bracelets are light enough to where you don't notice them that often, while obviously having a reliable and rugged movement inside. And so I feel like those ergonomics are one of the biggest attractions for me in Rolex, and that is clear and evident on this piece. One of the things that people complain about that I actually enjoy in terms of the design is the small crown. If you've seen a Rolex Submariner, that crown is a lot bigger, and this one's much, much smaller for the case, and it feels almost like the same size as my Explorer, that's 36mm, with the crown guards on either side. And it could be a little bit bigger, but I like how small it is proportionally to the entire face of the dial. It feels like it's smaller added feature rather than as prominent as you get with a big crown on a Submariner. So I have no problem with that. The best part about this watch is the thickness and the way it functions. So it is really thin, and one of the things that's really cool about the Explorer II is the fact that it has that steel bezel which slopes up from the sides. And so really when you look at it, because everything's kind of pulling away from you towards the crystal, what you mainly notice in terms of thickness to your eye is just the mid case, because the case back sinks into your wrist and then the bezel slopes away towards the crystal, and obviously the crystal is clear and hard to really see with the human eye. And so mainly what you notice when you look at it down the side in terms of thickness is just the mid case, which is really narrow. And so it gives you the impression that it's a lot thinner than it really is. Even though it's already a thin watch, it feels even thinner. And so again, ergonomically, I feel like this watch, wearability wise, is perfect. This is the kind of watch that I really, really like and really want to have in my collection because it just marries those things really well. Going straight into pros and cons. The best part about the Explorer II is also its biggest weakness, I'll touch on later, but that happens to be the fact that it's under the radar. If you want a traveler's watch, you want to be able to go to Europe, especially with what people are concerned about right now with crime and whatnot, having a watch that kind of disappears, that people don't notice as much, is really advantageous. You can't wear a Batman GMT without someone noticing. I was in Venice with my wife and a guy sat down to eat some ice cream. I looked over and it took me all of about a second and a half for me to see a brand new Rolex Batman on his wrist. And someone else was wearing a Pepsi, and they're just loud. And while some people are comfortable enough to wear those, I'm not one of those people. And so having a watch this subtle is really nice for the actual function it was built for, in my case being a traveler's watch. I could wear it and most people wouldn't know what it was. Other big pro I already talked about is wearability. I'm not going to touch on it anymore, but this thing wears like a dream. Another big pro for me is the polar dial. I like something different. I tend to gravitate towards black dials, and so I'm forcing myself to look towards something else because I'm getting a little bored with having black dial watches. I've had them almost the entire time I've been collecting, and now that I do reviews like this, I see so many different things come in that it's making me wish I had more different, less conservative pieces. And a white dial is about as not conservative as I'm going to push myself at the moment in my collecting journey in terms of actually owning a piece. And so that's something that I really like about it. It's different enough to where I really like it and I really enjoy it. Plus, I think my wife really likes how it matches white t-shirts. So that's a nice added feature. She tends to compliment when I pair the two. So the white dial is something I really like, especially set off with the red GMT hand. The overall function is obviously the other big pro. If you have a Rolex GMT watch or any Rolex watch, they all have a certain feeling to them. The way that they wind, the way that they work. The keyless works, everything in this watch is designed to fit a purpose and it's designed to work reliably. And that's something that obviously is in this watch in almost every piece. So the negatives is my kind of debate over the watch. The watch itself is beautiful. It's what I originally expected it to be, but I think I had kind of an image that I've seen online of an Explorer II in my mind for so long that when I have it in person, it doesn't have the same kind of magic. The same thing happened with the Speedmaster. If you look at images online that are well curated and are photoshopped and have extra contrast and have perfect lighting and everything is just laid out perfectly, it gives you the impression that the watch is a certain style, a certain feeling, and that it always looks that good. A good example of that is the steel bezel. When I see pictures of it, the writing on the numerals is always really crisp. I can see the black in those writing really, really well. Whereas in person, when I actually own the watch, sometimes in certain lighting, I can't really see those numerals that well at all. And I think it is one of those things that you learn when you own a watch. And I think it's one of those things that, you know, is kind of a downside to this day and age. Yes, it's great because it gets a lot of people into watches, but it also gives you an unrealistic expectation of how it's going to feel to see it. If you're seeing a picture and aspiring to own the watch, and then you actually own the watch, those feelings and those things that you see all the time are going to be very different. Because there's not much else that's really negative about the piece, the main one I'm going to hit on is kind of my story and why I have had a hard time actually wanting to keep the watch. And that's around how subtle it is. I just talked about how the bezel kind of disappears in different lights. And when you're spending a good amount of money on a watch, you want it to have a certain sort of magic to it. And I got spoiled. I think the Explorer, the original Explorer, especially the one that I have, the 114270, is the epitome of the perfect watch. And to try and follow up the feeling that I had with that watch and still have with that watch with something else is kind of a fool's errand. I'm never going to be able to do that. And so I have to be looking for different sorts of feelings because that elegant, understated nature is something I keep chasing after, but obviously is not as noticeable in a watch like this. Those black indices and the steel bezel don't give you that feeling of, man, this thing is luxurious, this thing is nice, this thing is a little flashy, but only to me. It doesn't give you that sort of feeling. And so it made me wonder whether or not I wanted something different. I think that the subtle nature of the watch is something that you're going to have to want. This can't be a watch that you're picking because you want a GMT Master 2 and you don't want to spend the extra money, or you want a GMT Master 2 but you know it's just maybe you can save the extra money and still have a GMT function. You have to want a subtle piece. You have to look at your collection and know you're not going after a more flashy watch. And I think for me, when I'm buying my first Rolex, or was buying my first Rolex, I wanted something that felt nice to me, that gave me that feeling of this is a luxury piece. Because this watch does not give me that much of that feeling. I mean, if my Explorer gives me a 10, a feeling of luxury, then this gives me like a 7, right? It's still there, but it's mainly a premium piece rather than just a overly luxurious piece, because it doesn't have the same flash. Things don't reflect off the crystal as much. The indices don't reflect. You don't have the same kind of reflection in the pool, the lacquer dial like you do on the Explorer. This one is just going to be a tool watch, and it's going to do its purpose, and it's going to do everything you want it to do, and it's going to have a nice white dial, but it's not going to be just overwhelmingly, wow, I've got a Rolex, this is really nice, I love it, that sort of feeling. If you're after that feeling, probably something else is going to give you that better than something like this. At least it was for me. So that's a roundabout way of saying that I really like this watch, and I think it fits in my collection really well. I think it's a watch that I want to keep, and the main reason for that, there are two. One is going to be the sentiment. I love that I bought it when I was with my wife on my honeymoon. The second one is going to be actually the engraving on the back and the provenance behind the piece. This watch has an interesting story. It was originally bought in 2011 by a ski instructor who skis in the Swiss Alps, and he bought it, I think, to commemorate his time skiing there. And so he actually engraved the back, celebrating the years that he worked at that ski resort and the name of the ski resort itself, both on the back of this watch. And that history behind the piece is something that I think is really nice and really important about these watches. Seeing where they came from, I think, is part of the fun, especially if it's a pre-owned piece. So those two things are ones that made me hold on to it, made me consider it, made me keep waiting. I put it back in its original watch box and let it sit for, I think, 3 weeks before I brought it back out and put it on again. And I found during that 3 weeks that I would think about wanting to take it out. But I kept waiting to see if that feeling would go away, and that I wanted to wear it instead of the other ones I had in my watch box. And that's what made me know that I really want to keep it, despite the lack of overwhelming luxuriousness, I suppose, is the best way to put it. So those are my thoughts on the Rolex Explorer II. Don't want to belabor the point. That's just kind of how I feel about it. And if you're interested in getting one, I just wanted to have a conversation about it without overhyping the Explorer II in general. Next, I'm going to be reviewing the Zenith Chronomaster Sport, a much, much flashier piece than something like this, also with a white dial, and giving my thoughts and impressions on that. So till then, take care.